I came all the way from Boston, but I came via Lindsay, Ontario, where my grandmother and her grandmother before her and her grandfather before her settled back in the early 19th century. So I have long roots in the Toronto area, but have been living in the States for 20 years or so. I've been all over the place, worked and studied and lived in a lot of different places. And I got my first computer, laptop in 1993, and it had 8 megabytes of RAM. And I was a pioneer. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the intangibles of all of this that we're struggling with. The law of accelerating returns that Ray Kurzweil coined is this notion that technological change is exponential. So the amount of change that will happen in the next 2 years, I'm making this up, but will approximate the amount of change that had happened in the previous 2,000 years. So how do we keep up? How do we, we start planning for something, several years before it actually happens and gets built. The auto industry has a 5 to 7 year research time between the inception of an idea and the actual market, get their product to market. How do we deal with this accelerating rate of change in technology and which affects everything in our daily lives? And at the same time, how do we deal with the ebb and flow of prosperity? This is a graph that shows, this is a particular city in the US, but pretty typical of a lot of Rust Belt cities. Maybe not so much of Canadian cities, because there were some different, more socially conscious programs or philosophies at work north of the border. But the notion that over the last 150 years, there have been these grand eras of industrial development, starting with the pre-industrial. Let me just explain this and I'll go through it. The blue is the population. This happens to be Dayton, Ohio. So it had its heyday in 1960, and it's almost, back down to half of its population at the height of its urban success. The red are obviously the kinds of inventions, the major activities that were happening in the economy. The green are the infrastructure elements, which, by the way, corresponded with every great era. There was a different kind of infrastructure that was working its way, that was being built kind of on a national scale. And then the lower one, which is something that people have been talking increasingly about, is the role of higher education in an economy that is increasingly knowledge-based and technologically savvy and operating in a way that is not just manufacturing, not just mass production related, but when you create knowledge, you have a more sustainable system. So that represents the kind of growth of education. So in that early industrial time, I can't see anything, the whole interrelationship between cities, so this is sort of represents, and of course this is American perspective, but there's a lot of similarities between Canadian cities and towns and American cities and towns. But there was this interrelationship between the waterways and the rail, the way that cities were built, and the industry that was being built within those cities. education during these eras was for the elite. You know, regular working people didn't really have access to education. By the industrial golden age, there was a sort of explosion of mass production. The highway system was starting to emerge. And rail and electricity distribution were happening. And higher ed started to become accessible. And you can see up there at the top, those little kind of pale red numbers represent the percentage of urbanized, of people living in urban centers versus rural centers during those several different points along that scale. Following the war, this massive highway investment, industry moved to the suburbs, academic and research parks moved to the suburbs as well in terms of thinking about relating to the industry that was emerging. And so there was this kind of like, we abandoned our cities in many regards, certainly in the US. And now what's happening now, I mean, it's been going on for several years now, is this moving, there is for the first time in the last census data in the US, there are more people moving into cities than there are people moving out of cities. So it's like the table is turning in terms of what the demographics are relative to urban centers. We have the whole kind of globalization occurring. More so now than ever before, there's this incredible integration and the realization of the role of institutions, of universities, colleges, and research institutions in the economic development and the urban success of the cities that they are hosts, that host them. So I'm going to kind of this is a bit of a smorgasbord in terms of a lot of different things. Some of it's work I've done myself. A lot of it is just things I've seen. You know, and some of it might bore you to death, but other parts of it might be kind of interesting, fascinating, and nothing is very deep. It's all kind of like a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Just to give you a sense of what I see, you know, working nationally and internationally, are some of the things we ought to be thinking about, because they're not happening. They might not be happening here now, but they're starting to happen elsewhere, and they're going to happen likely. So we ought to be aware of them and thinking of how we can plan for change. So work. I just showed you that kind of timeline of the interrelationship between the kinds of work we do, the urban context in which we do it, and the infrastructure we need in order to make it function. Liberty Village was one of those amazing kind of, what's the word? Very important. We were very proud of our work. It was our place of, where we, in our breaks, we'd have, recreation, we'd be, playing baseball. It was the golden age. It was something work was an amazing thing, and there was something grand about it. And the buildings we built and the infrastructure we built was grand in scale. And then, there was a lot of this kind of, the city couldn't support manufacturing. The companies were moving out of the city and overseas, where labor's cheap. And at the same time, the rise of the knowledge economy, and this is in Boston, that's one of the centers of the birthplaces of the knowledge economy. This was also happening. So there was this kind of transformation occurring, huge structural transformation occurring. And this is Liberty Village. You know, we have these grand older structures that were maybe not being used as much as they had been in the past. At the same time, there's a particular focus these days on entrepreneurship. In the U.S., what happened after the recession, the Great Recession, is that a lot of students who couldn't find employment in the big centers, like the San Franciscos and the New Yorks and the Bostons, ended up staying in places like Detroit or going home after college because they couldn't find a job and starting up their own thing. And this whole DIY, the do-it-yourself kind of culture is emerging in some of these cities where there were really no other opportunities, but the land is incredibly cheap. You can buy a house in Detroit, beautiful house for $5,000. You know, it's a little dangerous at times, but I mean, there's a informal movement that happens because of the formal changes that are occurring in the economy. The whole focus and understanding of the economy as something that's more than just like a single bullet, that you know, we all are trying to attract the Google or the Microsoft or the one big company or the handful of big companies that will provide all of the employment. But the reality of it is that there's a whole ecosystem. I think Lori was talking about the whole notion of an ecosystem of supportive industry, both within industry clusters, but the amounts of inventions that occur at the junction between industry clusters is also a very important part of creating the fertile ground for innovation and creative industry. And the whole notion that Michael was talking about creating places for collaboration to occur on many different levels is something that everyone's talking about in every sector these days. Someone, I think, was talking about this idea where you don't actually have your own desk. This is a bank in Australia where nobody has their own office. When you come in the morning, you figure out what you need to do, what kind of space you need, and you check it out. And it, I think, rather than building 150 square feet per person, it's something like 100 square feet per person. So it's you know, an idea about different ways that we're working these days. I mean, these things must be popping up all over Toronto, but across U.S. cities, the co-work movement is just off the charts. People are looking for spaces where they can just rent a desk, not even full-time, maybe 10 hours a week. For cheap you know, cheap, and where they have access to things like a conference room or a quiet space for teleconferencing, or you know, in some cases, and I'll get to it in a minute, the whole idea of sharing tools and equipment and technical support from lawyers and business development people and folks that are going to help you as an individual or as a small emerging creative type, get a hold on how to make it into a business venture. This is a topic that I'm particularly interested in, is the whole nature of manufacturing. And in the last 3 or 4 years, there's a whole renaissance going on in some parts of manufacturing, in the high end, what we call the 21st century manufacturing, which is those very automated, but still, you know, you still need skilled labor. You don't need PhDs or, you know, folks who have 25 years of education under their belt. But you need people who have skills, and they develop those skills and they evolve those skills over time. This is coming back to North America now because of the dynamics of cost of labor and the regulatory issues that are occurring globally. So there's a lot of things happening that are bringing these kinds of opportunities back to us. This is a company that's a web-based company. It's a car manufacturing company that gets orders from all over the country. And if they get, you go online and you sort of pick and choose kind of a catalog. What kind of headlights do I want? What kind of bumper do I want? If they get enough orders from one location, they'll move to that location and set up a micro factory, and have, you will go and participate in the building of your car with the experts in this temporary factory. Now, here's the thing. This is a website, so I haven't gone to that factory, and I don't know if it really exists. But it's a pretty amazing idea. and then the whole maker movement, similar to the co-working movement, is this ground-up cultural swell. Boston has about 6 of these now. 2 years ago, they didn't have any. Boston and the surrounding cities, where there are, where you can rent a cubicle, like a 10 by 10 cubicle, and you have access to all the tools, the lathes and the drill presses and the 3D printing machines that were either donated from test sites or collected from high schools and middle schools, which no longer have any of those machines anymore. There are warehouses full of lathes and drill presses from public education that no longer uses there's no longer shop class. Did any of you guys do shop class? Yeah, you're all the ones that are over. Maybe it's different in Canada. In the U.S., in the 90s, all public education lost its shop. So this is what this maker movement is really being looked at as a cultural need. It's like something that people are really wanting. They really want a place to go and be able to make something and do something like real with their hands, as opposed to always be working digitally. And then this whole thing about innovation districts, which the Brookings Institute, Bruce Katz of the Brookings Institute made, kind of like the Richard Florida of another Richard Florida. Well, maybe not quite Richard Florida, but they kind of popularized this idea last year. Although you know, people have been talking about this idea of creating districts where you're really putting in the infrastructure that allow kind of economic development to occur. It's a very different thing than what we used to do 10 years ago, where we'd spend all our time trying to attract, you know, Pfizer or a Google to the city. Now we're like, okay, what's here now? And how can we support it and actually nurture people to make something grow into real businesses? At the same time, and you guys are probably experiencing this, there's a lot of change happening in higher education. Way more focus in the last 5 years, I would say, on project-based learning, on creating environments for students and faculty and graduates to engage in trying to work on real-world problems and real-world inventions, so that it's not just all theoretical, it's not just all kind of about your educational experience, but you're getting much more set up for when you get, you know, when you step foot out into the real world. All Stanford and all over the U.S. in universities, they're building these new kinds of classrooms and new kinds of learning environments. Don, you were talking about non-traditional families and building intergenerational housing, and the idea that this is the West Campus of Calgary, and there the whole idea was to create building types that would allow for over time, or even at the same time, a whole kind of different arrangement of if you have a family and you need a place, you can rent out a place for a graduate student, or it's creating a kind of a flexible typology that allows the place to change over time. The micro unit is being built in Boston, San Francisco, Seattle. I'm sure it's very much so being built here, but you know, building housing that's 250 or 300 square feet to try to make it more affordable. Because that's the one thing we haven't talked about a lot today, is the whole question of who actually gets to live in these crazy new creative cities. And, you know, thinking about live, work, and getting off the grid. I wanted to share with you, since last spring, I've been involved in the Audi Urban Future Initiative, which is a competition that Audi, the car company, runs to try to make them feel more relevant, I think. But I think there are some of them that are genuinely interested in how their technology meshes with the urban infrastructure. Because, you know, you can build as many new cars, interesting cars as you want, but if it doesn't work within the infrastructure that we have today or will have in the future, then what's the point? So a lot of things are happening right now, and if this is the one thing that I think we can already start to track that we're in a revolution. We're in some kind of a mobility revolution right now. The autonomous cars, the driverless, the piloted parking technology, all this technology exists. If you buy a new car today, it's likely in your car. It just can't be, it's not fully operational because of the legal challenges and all of the regulatory questions. So what we did was we created a digital model, a database that allowed us to project the future of mobility on project these trends in car sharing, in automated systems, on the future of cities. And we looked at a particular part of Boston, this is in Somerville actually, Union Square, where today, based on current zoning, and I know in US cities, the podium tower typology is very much a result of parking requirements, parking standards, and which require you to have X amount of spaces and makes it very difficult to do anything else in terms of a footprint. So this was a sort of thought that blue, if we're just going to operate business as usual, in 25 years, that blue represents how much of those buildings would be parking. And in a future where you can actually trend out the car sharing and the automated technologies, you can project a future where there's a lot less road required and a lot less parking required. But we don't do this kind of planning normally. I mean, it's very speculative, but this is the planning we probably should be doing. So the idea that you know, piloted parking, cars can go in and this is too slow. They wouldn't be driving this slow, but they can come down the ramp and there's no people in this, and they can park, and then, you know, others can come out, and all these cars are just driving themselves because somebody typed in their app and said, I need my car. A signal, a traffic signal the cars are talking to each other and the signals are talking to the cars and registering where the people are and where the cars are. But this is technology that Audi is actually developing. They have a signal, a car-to-X technology that they're developing. So, I mean, imagine, right? The thing that I was most fascinated by was the fact that you remember those podiums. you can achieve the same kind of densities. If you can do the parking remotely and do a lot less of it, you've suddenly opened up the possibility of creating a whole different kind of urban fabric where we could build in those kind of spaces that every single one of these panelists have been talking about today, and create that kind of fine-grain quality to the city. These kind of alleyways and storefronts that are only 4 feet wide. And, all of those things have affordability implications. If I can rent a space that's only 26 square feet, it's going to be a lot cheaper for me than if I can only find spaces that are 250 square feet. You guys probably know more than I do, but the whole urban agriculture movement, many cities in the U.S. are changing their codes so that you can actually farm in the city on your roof or on your wall. There's a ton of work being done on trying to figure out how to retrofit existing city districts so that they have systems that are that they think about the energy and the water systems within a district, an existing district, and how to retrofit it to make it more sustainable. That was Portland State. And, this is happening in Toronto, too, is the whole idea of reclaiming the road that we've been using for automobiles for the last 50 years, 60 years, and turning it into public spaces, letting it be part of, multi-modes, giving it multi-modes. And what I'm kind of most excited about is this whole movement where, I practiced in the U.S. for 20 years, and 10 years ago, in some of the places I was working, East Baltimore, Buffalo, Rochester, Boston even, San Diego, if you proposed a public space that was public, that no one owned, it would be like, oh, no, that's like eyes on the park, we're going to have drug dealers in the bushes. And now, in the last 2 or 3 years, there's this in every major city, there's this amazing activism occurring. The whole pop-up park, farmers markets are coming back. The installation of furniture and pop-up, the parking day. Do you have that here in Canada? So it's a global event, yeah. Just not in Canada. But I mean, it's sort of like a test. You test if you don't need all that parking, and you let people use a parking space and move into a parking space on like a Saturday. And what they've discovered is that they don't actually need all that parking. So I think that's a parking day library and another parking day. These are all parking day installations. And the other thing, which I'm sure you have right here right here, is pop-up retail. In some places, like in one of these is in New York, the other's in Australia. The whole idea of using temporary, like movable structures to create retail venues for retailers, small-scale retailers, and food. And another big movement is this whole Maker Faire movement, which I don't know whether you guys have got here in Canada yet. But basically, it's all the tinkerers and the people who are doing stuff in their garage that have this organization. Maker Faire comes to town and organizes a Tinker Maker Faire for everybody who wants to, can come out with their crazy ideas. And you can't talk about any of this without talking about some of the new sources of funding. So I'm not going to dwell on this, but this is one, the whole notion that there's ways of financing things that are not traditional ways is something that we really ought to be thinking about more. And then I'm just going to end with a snapshot of 5 different districts. I think this speaks to the question that's come up about the traditional role of government versus higher education or anchor institutions, of the private development sector, the nonprofit sector, and then in general the public, the community-based activism that occurs. That today there's a lot of blurring going on between those sectors, and there are many examples today of districts that have an organizational structure that are mission-driven. They're not profit-driven, they're mission-driven, they have a real estate agenda and a development and an urban regeneration agenda, but they're run like a business that's about regenerating and creating economic development in a district of the city. So I'm sure you've heard of AT22, Barcelona's Innovation District, which is a quasi-public organization that moved into this the Pompidou, I think, district, an old kind of rundown industrial part, mixed-use industrial part of Barcelona, and has created the momentum. The organization has attracted and created this amazing mix of, I think there are 20 different universities or university centers that have that are focused on those 5 sectors. I can't remember what they are, but there's technology, design, blah 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 blah, and then businesses. So they're choreographing this interrelationship between institutions, young people doing research and studying and thinking new thoughts in certain fields, and the businesses that are kind of working in these fields, and then choreographing it in a mixed-use kind of arrangement where there's housing and workspace and lots of good public space as well. Right here in Canada, the Great Northern Way campus in Vancouver is actually a university development trust that operates on behalf of the 4 institutions in Vancouver: UBC, Simon Fraser University, Emily Carr University of Art and Design, and the British Columbia Institute of Technology. And their mandate is to create a mixed-use district that has 1/3 residential, 1/3 commercial, all focused around the digital arts and media clusters, and 1/3 institutional. The Fringe in Cape Town, as far as I can tell, this is just a marketing idea. There's nothing legal about it. There's no people involved. But it's a notion of you create a name for a district and you give it a mission, and it's basically, this is a marketing tool. It's not a development tool. The TECHTOWN in Midtown Detroit is a collaboration between 2 or 3 different universities, institutions, and a nonprofit development corporation in Midtown Detroit. So it's a nonprofit development corporation that's managing and championing and wakes up every day thinking about the future of the little people in that diagram who are doing whatever they're doing in those collaboration cubes. And not the PROTLAND, but the Portland State University District is a whole other idea where the city has altered its urban renewal boundary in order to give the university tools, development tools, that allow it to use, to actually make the bottom line work on certain, and use tax increment financing to make developments work within a district that's adjacent to their university. And the California College of Arts is just in the Mission District, is just It's an anchor institution, maybe a little bit like Ontario College of Art, that created the momentum in a district. It attracted people to a district that was kind of on the fringe, and it's sort of taken hold. So all of these, and like finally, this is one in San Diego that's being run by a couple of developers who think that they can create value by creating an idea that they are selling and marketing. And bringing the people together and organizing the community to have this new district emerge. It's got all the ingredients, but it's developer-driven. So you've got city-driven, you've got quasi-public, you've got private developers, you've got nonprofits, you've got some that are just marketing. You've got all these different ways of organizing and moving and championing this notion of a district. So I just want to end with one quick thought, which is that buildings aren't creative. Buildings are buildings. People are creative. And what buildings do, and what, along with policy, along with all of these other things that we either allow and support and nurture, or we don't, is what happens, is what creates creative change. So it's not just the buildings. Thank you.